Hi everyone, and welcome back to another devlog from my indie retro RPG. In the last devlog, I fleshed out the combat by adding a bunch of abilities for both the player and enemies to use. Now that I've got the major building blocks of the combat working, I'm going to turn my attention to some fine-tuning with stats. Up to this point, I've been just using placeholder numbers as I added and tested abilities. Although I've had a bunch of stats assigned to the player and enemies, they weren't being used to calculate anything. Now that the abilities are all working, I'm going to start making damage, health, energy, mana, dodges, and so on calculated using stats. I started with damage. What I decided on is to make strength affect physical damage. Basically, any damage done by weapons, and intelligence affect spell damage. So in code, I added a check when an ability is used to determine which stat to use. For physical attacks, the damage is decided by a random roll between strength and strength plus attack power. Attack power is a stat that's a combination of your weapon's attack power and the attack power of the ability you're using. So if you have, say, 15 strength, a weapon with 10 attack power, and you're using an ability with 10 attack power, you'll deal random damage between 15 and 35. Damage for spells is the same, except instead of strength acting as the base, intelligence will serve that function. Also, weapon attack power won't affect spells, so it'll be purely based on your intelligence and the attack power of the spell you're using. That means that spells will have higher base attack powers than physical abilities in most cases. After getting the damage working, I added in armor and resistances. Armor lowers the damage received from physical attacks, and resistances lower the damage of spells depending on the type. I have 5 resistances in the game: fire, cold, bleed, poison, and disease. Each point you have in armor or a resistance will slightly decrease the damage you receive of that type. The next stats I turned my attention to were agility and dexterity. In my game, agility affects your ability to dodge attacks, and dexterity affects your ability to land physical attacks. When you use an ability, before the damage is dealt to the target, I do a roll for a random number between 1 and 100. Each player and enemy has a low base chance to land hits, and each point of dexterity slightly increases that chance. If the random number is under the threshold, the hit lands. If it's over, it misses. So for example, let's say you have a base chance to hit of 70, and your dexterity bumps that number up to 80. If the number rolled is under 80, the hit will land. That way, as you increase your dexterity, that hit threshold will increase your chances of landing. Hits will go up as well. Next, if a hit does land, before dealing the damage, I do a roll for dodging using agility. The player and enemies have a base chance to dodge, and every point in agility increases that. Again, if the roll is less than the dodge threshold, the hit will be dodged. So with all of that together, I now have a pretty fleshed out damage system. You use an ability with a slightly randomized damage. That damage is also affected by the target's armor and resistances. Then you may or may not land the hit depending on your dexterity, and then the target might dodge your hit depending on agility. So now with all these start coming into play, it's creating a system that will adapt as you equip items, level up, and use buffs and debuffs. So it's really all coming together. The last core stat I have is stamina, and this is a dual purpose stat because it's used to calculate your max hit points and also your max energy. Energy is the resource you spend to use physical attacks. Intelligence is used to calculate your max mana, which is what you use to spend on spells. You've probably noticed that everything still looks super bare bones. I've purposefully been focusing on function over form, since this is still in a sort of prototype alpha phase. I don't want to spend time on fluff and visual things that don't really affect the core gameplay loop until I get the foundation really solid. But I did decide to add a bit of visual fluff just because it's helpful for testing. So in this video, you've probably seen that I've incorporated floating combat text when abilities land or miss or dodge. And another thing I did with that is I color-coded the text based on the type of damage being dealt. So blue for cold damage, green for poison damage, for example. This lets me a lot more easily and quickly test abilities because if I would need to see if certain ability is landing and calculating a certain type of damage, I can see it visually instead of having to print to the console like I've been doing. So this is just a start with these stats and calculations. There's going to be a lot of play testing involved to see what feels right, and I'll definitely make adjustments and possibly even large changes to how things are calculated. Um, it's it's really starting to feel like a fun game, though. Really starting to feel like a retro RPG. Um, so I'm very excited, and I hope to have a version of the game up on itch.io at some point in the nearish future for people to play, because I'd love to get feedback on just how it feels and what people think about it. So as always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.